Chapter 21 June 1974, Islamabad. John had been sitting in the living room for nearly an hour and was now restless and bored with waiting. The dinner reservation to celebrate his and Marian's wedding anniversary was to be a special occasion, made even more so by Harry's presence. And when the two of them had headed out early that afternoon for their hike at the national park, they had promised to be back in plenty of time to get to the restaurant. Yet the reservation time had come and gone, and still he waited, drumming his fingers on the table and idly watching the TV. He frowned at the screen. The news was on now, and it was all bad. Continuing coverage of the violent Pakistani protests against India's first nuclear bomb test. Little had happened in the past 2 days to diminish the fear and anger so evident on the streets. Right now, a prominent nuclear scientist was arguing vehemently against the tests, warning that Pakistan would not give in to its neighbors' nuclear threats and would have its own nuclear weapons soon. He closed his eyes to block out the sight, reminded of Hanif's accusations yesterday. You knew India was making bombs, but you chose not to stop them, and even help them to do it. And now, you want to cancel your aid to Pakistan and threaten to shut down our research reactor because of one batch of missing uranium. How is that fair? That's why Pakistanis don't trust your government. In fact, we hate you Americans. Just because you're rich, you think you can do whatever you like. But money can't buy our friendship or our forgiveness. He turned off the TV, sick of the grandstanding and threatening words. One of Marian's novels lay on the table, and he picked it up, flipping through the pages to find something to take his mind off the passing time. By 9 o'clock, he was sick with worry. The minutes dragged by, each torturous second ticking by at an agonizingly slow pace. Several times, he picked up the telephone, thinking he should ask the U.S. Embassy for help. But each time he heard the prim, distant voice of the recorded message, he slammed the receiver down in despair. Once or twice he dozed off until an unknown noise would jerk him awake again. Then he'd run to the window, sure they were home, searching for their shadows in the darkness until the world sank back into uneasy silence. The sky was well lit when the sharp ring of the telephone snapped him out of the sofa, where he'd eventually fallen into an exhausted sleep. Hope tearing at his heart, he grabbed the phone. Harry? Marian? Where are you? A wavering silence answered him, though he could hear unsteady breathing on the line. Marian, are you there? JohnThompson. My name is Walter Hansen. I'm a military attaché at the U.S. Embassy. John froze, unable to speak. Fear clutched at him. Why would someone from the embassy, especially Harry's CIA contact, call me? Are you there? Asked Walter. Yes. John, the Islamabad police called. Harry and Marian were in a car accident last night. Marian is at Islamabad Central Hospital. She's in a coma, already in surgery. But Harry, he died at the scene, John. I'm so sorry. John squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the words. The entire night he'd been avoiding that exact thought, refusing to even consider the possibility. Harry was an excellent driver. He couldn't have had an accident. It must be a mistake. Or maybe Walter wasn't telling him everything. But Marian. He said Marian was in the hospital. It couldn't be. But somehow it was true. Harry was dead. Oh my God, John cried. He swayed, violently dizzy, as if the earth had tilted and he was spinning, falling through empty space. His hand found the desk next to him, and he leaned hard onto the smooth surface to keep from falling. The telephone slipped out of his hand and clattered to the floor, Walter's voice demanding, John, are you okay? John, can you get to the hospital? I'll meet you there. John! When John arrived at Islamabad Central Hospital, Walter was already outside the operating room, waiting for him. His long, lanky frame seemed to fill the narrow hallway, and the crop of ginger hair on his head was in disarray, as if he hadn't taken the time to comb it. He shook John's hand and said sympathetically, "Walter Hansen, military attaché at the embassy. I'm deeply sorry for what's happened, John. The ambassador asked me to pass on her condolences as well. Apparently, nobody saw the accident happen. It was only discovered about 4 o'clock this morning when a car drove past. The driver called the ambulance. It looked like Marian hit the windshield, blood all over her. The doctor said she had internal injuries as well. They're in surgery now, trying to save her." John stood silently, his head tipped back toward the ceiling, eyes closed, tears streaming down his face. Walter put a hand on his arm. "John, you look pale. Why don't you come sit down?" John shook the hand off. He wiped the tears and blew his nose, turning to stare out the narrow window. "Marian will be in surgery for a while. I'm sorry, John, but you need to identify Harry's body." Walter's voice was gentle, but his arm steered John firmly down the hall. "He's in the hospital morgue. Let's find someone to take us there." "How did it happen?" John asked, reluctantly walking toward the nurse's station. "I went out to take a look at the accident site as soon as it got light. It looked like another car hit Harry's car from behind, on the left. Harry lost control and went into a ditch. 2 other bodies were found at the site. Pakistanis. They must have been walking along the road and Harry hit them." "Shit." Walter hesitated. "Do you know where your wife and Harry were yesterday afternoon?" "They went hiking at Margala National Park. They should have been back about 5 o'clock. His eyes filled with tears again. "We were supposed to be going out to dinner afterwards to celebrate our anniversary." "Did Harry mention anything unusual to you before they left?" "Not that I can think of." John shook his head slowly. "Harry was a good driver. It's hard to believe he would lose control like that." Walter did not comment. At the far end of the hospital, Harry's body lay on a morgue table under a white sheet. John had to steel himself to pull the cloth back. Even so, the blood and mud that covered his friend tugged at his heart. Forcing himself to look, John noticed 2 wounds in Harry's chest, not the jagged slices from broken glass that peppered his face and arms, but 2 perfect round holes. He looked at Walter and said hesitantly, "I think Harry was shot. Those look like bullet holes." Walter's gaze raked across the body, and then swung up and fixed on the Pakistani doctor who stood on the other side of the table. He said, "Thank you," and pulled John back out of the room. Saying nothing on the long walk back, John's trepidation grew with each silent footstep. The light above the operating room door still glowed red. Walter gestured overhead. "She's still in there. No way to tell how long it'll take." He peered at John's drawn face. "Are you hungry?" John shook his head, his mind still on the wounds in Harry's chest. He looked directly into Walter's eyes. Is it possible that this wasn't an accident? Could Harry have been murdered? "Murdered?" Walter feigned surprise, staring at John for a long few seconds before glancing down the hall. The surgical area was empty. "What makes you think that?" "You know why Harry came here, don't you?" John demanded. "You were his contact in the CIA. Harry must have found something out, maybe proof of Pakistan's true nuclear ambitions, and Pakistan intelligence wanted to keep him quiet. Looks like they succeeded." "You have a vivid imagination." Walter forced a smile. "I don't know what Harry told you, John, but he came here on his own business. Nothing more. Nothing official. Something about importing leather goods, I believe." He gave John a penetrating look. And you are here as part of our government's nuclear power assistance program, correct? Whatever happened was an accident. A terrible tragedy, but an accident. No, I know that Harry... Walter put up his hand to interrupt the thought. It looks like Marian will be in surgery for a while. I have to get back to work. Here's my business card. Call me later if you need anything. John watched him disappear into the elevator. Emotions swirled in his mind. Disappointment, loneliness, guilt. He stared out the window, thinking of Marian and Harry. The two of them had been part of his life since he was a child. They had shared so much joy and happiness. But now, all that had been swept away. Harry was gone, and Marian was in critical condition, struggling to survive. Life was so short and utterly unpredictable. He heaved a deep sigh, wishing he had cherished their time together and shown Marian more adoration. Tears streaked his face again. God, merciful God, he prayed fervently. You've already taken away Harry. Please, don't take Marian from me too. Please, God, don't let her die. He turned at the clank of the door opening behind him, his face hopeful as the doctors and nurses trudged out. One doctor approached him. You're Mr. Thompson. I'm terribly sorry. Your wife died on the operating table. She suffered a severe head injury and trauma to the spine, in addition to numerous broken bones and extensive internal organ damage. We did everything we could for her, but... He shook his head. Even if she had survived, life would not have been the same. John's knees went weak, his face ashen. The doctor put a hand out to steady him and said again, I'm sorry. I wish I could have saved her. John nodded mutely. His body twitched, and he thought he might be sick. The rest of the doctor's words came at him faintly, as if he were far away, and his vision blurred until he could see nothing but Marian's face. He thought he heard her calling his name. Somehow his legs carried him into the operating room. Marian looked like she was asleep, peaceful except for the bandages that covered her head. He bent down, cupped her face in his palms, and kissed her pale lips. Clasping her to his chest, he rocked back and forth, whispering, Honey, I'm here. I love you. I love you. I love you. John didn't remember how he got out of the hospital. Exhaustion consumed him as he dragged himself back to his car. Beyond going home, temporary home, he reminded himself, he had not the slightest thought. He couldn't envision past the immediate goal. However, reality hit hard as soon as he opened the front door, shocking him out of his stupor. The house had been ransacked. Papers, books, clothing, even dishes were strewn everywhere, littering the floor so he could scarcely walk. Sofa cushions and pillows had been ripped open and shredded. He quickly went through the house, anger replacing his fatigue and sorrow. Marian's gold necklace and their stash of emergency cash in the desk drawer were missing. Beyond that, it was hard to tell what else had been taken. At the door to the guest room, he stopped, aghast. The contents of Harry's suitcase had been dumped out on the floor. Pants and jackets had been carelessly ripped apart. Even the suitcase lining had been slashed open. Wading through the debris, John's toe hit something solid. He leaned over and picked up a small, framed photo. Amazingly, it was still intact. Looking at the photo, he felt his anger drain away, replaced by grief. Standing in front of their parents, Harry and Marian smiled at him, both wearing their elementary school uniforms. Marian's curly hair spread over her shoulders, making her look like an angel in some 18th century painting. Harry wore an impish grin, What a beautiful family, John thought. His fingers stroked the photo as tears blurred his sight. Then a wave of nausea swept over him. He dropped the photo and pressed his fingers against his temples, trying to fight the sick feeling. He should have kept Marian safe and happy, but he had failed miserably. Instead, hiding his own weakness and ignorance behind Harry's strength. He could have saved their lives if he had called for a search party earlier. Instead, he had fallen asleep unforgivably. He had single-handedly ruined Marian's life. How could he claim to be a man if he were responsible for the death of his own beloved? Deep sorrow and even deeper guilt consumed him. He went to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of rum, tossing it back so fast he didn't even taste it. He needed something strong enough to pull him through this crisis, so he could learn to live with his shame. The alcohol burned from his throat, cleared down to his stomach, and he swiftly poured another. This one he carried back to the lounge, sipping as he went. Flinging the window open, he got a double shock. The weather had changed, and he shivered involuntarily as the cold air swept through the darkness. But what startled him most was the sight of his neighbor sitting in his car. It was 8 o'clock, according to John's watch. Why wasn't Hassan inside his house like most people? John shivered again, this time not from the cold. Maybe Harry's suspicion had been right, he thought. Maybe Hassan was an intelligence agent, a spy sent to watch him. Maybe he'd been under surveillance since he'd arrived in Pakistan. Maybe he was being watched right now. The rising mixture of fear and distrust sickened him. Abruptly, he closed the window, pulled the blinds, and turned to face the disturbing scene inside the house. Someone had been searching for something beyond ordinary valuables, and if they hadn't found it, they would likely be back to search again. After a few moments of deliberation, he picked up the phone, letting out a sigh of relief when he heard the dial tone. After listening without interruption to John's description, Walter said without any hesitation, "Get out of the house. You can stay in the foreign diplomat compound. I'll come pick you up in an hour." "Okay," he responded mechanically, not surprised by the offer. Somehow, he knew Walter was expecting his call and had made the decision in advance. The diplomatic compound was near Islamabad's city centre. A lone gate breached the 9-foot solid concrete wall. A Pakistani soldier stood on either side of the gate, AK-47s on prominent display. In the middle of the courtyard, a round fountain with a Baroque floral urn gave the 2-story compound a Western cultural touch. Behind the fountain rose the ambassador's residence, flanked by buildings that housed security guards, embassy staff, and guests. John was allocated a room on the first floor. He felt exhausted, but his brain still teemed with thoughts. The last 24 hours ran through his mind like a horror movie, lurid scenes of blood and destruction flashing back and forth between Marian and Harry's faces. Anger, guilt, and unspeakable sorrow competed for his energy until he finally collapsed on the bed. Even in sleep, though, his thoughts haunted him. He saw Harry rise from a pool of blood, walking toward him and shaking his finger in admonition. Somehow, his business suit and blue and white check tie were unstained. "You tell those dickheads in Washington that our nuclear proliferation policy is a total failure in Pakistan," said Harry with a laugh. "They won't listen to me, and the embassy here will still try to paint me black. But you're a scientist, working directly on the policy for the people. They'll listen to you. I hope." Then suddenly blood was streaming down, drenching his clothes, and his words faded as Harry turned and walked out the door, leaving a trail of bloody footprints on the carpet. But Harry, wait, Harry! John woke to the sound of his own voice and found himself crying in the darkness.